Welcome back to our Wednesday Word. I've so enjoyed the past few weeks in 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning at the start of the chapter where it says, like newborn babes, long for the pure milk of the Word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation. And then building upon that, this last Sunday we saw that Christ is not just the milk we desire, but He's the precious and chosen cornerstone that we come to. And as individuals and as the church, we build our lives upon. Now some will reject the stone, and some will stumble over it into eternal doom. But then we read in verse 7, to you who believe, He is precious. And what I want us to consider is notice what happens when we connect verses 4 and 7. Because in verse 4, Christ is shown as this chosen and precious stone in the sight of God. And then in verse 7, He is therefore precious to us who believe. So we, in a sense, choose what our Father chooses. We feel to be precious what the Father feels to be precious. And we see again how saving faith, I think, is not just agreeing that certain facts are true, but saving faith signifies a new nature. And the evidence of that new nature is that it desires Christ and it cherishes Christ as precious. And so when Peter says to you who believe He is precious, he's showing that what distinguishes believers from unbelievers is not just that there are really spiritual believers who desire Christ and they feel the weight of His preciousness. So he's saying that if you're a believer, if you are saved, for you Christ is precious. And if you don't recognize His preciousness, and then going a little further back to verse 2, if you don't desire Him like a babe desires milk, you might want to examine the roots of your faith and see if they're sucking up life from the precious blood of Christ, the promises of God, or maybe they're simply curled around the dry rocks of our habits and traditions and customs and forms, or peer pressure. And so the question is Christ an allurement to your affections, or is it just duty to be performed? Are you moved by your desire for Him? Or are you moved simply because of the expectations that your church has or your family has? To you who believe, that's so key. He is precious. But how precious? How much is Jesus worth, really? Where does He come in your scale of desires? And Jesus tells a parable that describes how precious it truly is to inherit the kingdom of heaven. And since He Himself is the king of that kingdom, and He's the one who makes it valuable, in fact, the parable applies to Him too. Well, Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that's hidden in a field where a man found it, he covered it up, and then in his joy, he goes and sells everything that he has and he buys that field. And of course, we should notice that man doesn't sell all he has begrudgingly, he does it joyfully. And the reason is because he sees how precious the treasure is. He knows that whatever he has to pay for that field, it's a steal. Because Jesus is worth so much more than anything else in all the world. That every loss endured to have more of Him can be endured, and even endured joyfully. And I think Paul even gives us a great example of that in Philippians chapter 3, verse 7, where he says, whatever gain I had, I counted loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss for the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For His sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as refuse in order that I might gain Christ. And so I think the mark of a saint, a child of God, is not that we have attained something or are perfect, but that we long for Christ. We thirst like hungry babies for His word, for fellowship, for power. No Christian, I think, should be satisfied with his or her present condition, but we should be hungry. And the more that we taste, the hungrier we get for Jesus. His value doesn't diminish. There's no depreciation with time. It increases, in fact. And the better that we know Him, the more we love Him. And when we finally enter into His presence with rejoicing on that day, Our endless song is going to echo the one that's even already going on now. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. Your mouth, I think, is always full of praises for what you value most. And so we would echo Peter's words to you who believe. He is precious.